Chapter 14. The Evolution of a Planetary Being. In the previous lecture, the evolution of the divine sparks was traced from the time wherein all those of the same type gathered themselves together and formed a group consciousness. We then traced the phases of the development of these groups from one plane to another upon each planet, adding a shell of the atoms of that plane to the concentric layers of atoms revolving about the nucleus of the original traveling atom, until finally, upon the first plane, we find 7 shells about the central nucleus of the divine spark. The relationship of the seed atom, the traveling atom, and the 7 shells is complex, and must receive further elucidation before we proceed. The traveling atom is a projection, not of the Logos, but of the cosmos. It is thus at the same time more primitive and more closely related to the ultimate source of existence than a projection of the Logos could be. The Logos projects the general framework of forces and phases which condition the universe as a whole. The cosmic atoms, which have come under the influence of the Logos, project the innumerable units which the logoidal concept binds into an aggregate. The cosmic atoms are really younger brethren of the Logos, cosmic units themselves that have not reached the development which the Logos has reached, but are of the same type. Therefore, each atom of a logoidal universe is, for this reason, a potential divinity. Remember now that movement is the basis of all things. Abstract movements which are opposed lock up force and render it static, fixed. It is these locked-up forces which become form. A form is simply force which is not free to move. Any series of changes which are completely compensatory settle down into a cycle of action and reaction. As soon as such a cycle is established, it cannot change its mode of motion, and therefore a force is locked up, not in a motionless point, but in a spinning ring. The points are units. The rings are organisms. Either a unit or a ring, when once established, can move as a whole, and when this movement of an object takes place, there are 2 factors present: the object which moves and the movement it makes. The movement apart from the object is of the same nature as the movement which gave rise to the object. When you get an uncoordinated movement, such as the tangential movement of the atoms before they are coordinated, there is no permanency of rhythm, and therefore no form is created. But as soon as a compensatory coordination is established, forms of abstract movement are built. This principle applies to many considerations, and is therefore elaborated here in order that it may be available for future reference, and that when the abstract archetypes of anything are referred to, you will know that it is this replica of a rhythm impacted on another plane, as a vibration which is referred to. This is the key to the nature of memory. Before proceeding further with the study of the evolution of the divine sparks, we will refer to the evolution of the archetypes of the globes or satellites whose origin has been described. The unifying of the divine sparks into a group consciousness gave rise, as aforesaid, to the organization of their attendant atoms into the corresponding geometrical forms. After the dispersal of the atoms, the archetypical form remains, according to the law above described. This form is a miniature replica of the Logos, under that aspect in which it is presented to its universe, that is to say, as a system of stresses. This system of stresses organizes the atoms of the planes on which it is into its framework, and thus equips itself with a definite form. There will then exist, in addition to the evolutionary swarm of divine sparks, a planetary being with a spherical body, built up on a framework of stresses, and this planetary being will be profoundly imbued with the type of activity and organization that was the characteristic of the swarm of the divine sparks during that phase of their evolution when they occupied its sphere. When the next swarm comes to this phase, they find that their evolution has to take place in relation to the planetary being, which is lord of that sphere because it is the dominating influence thereon. They will find, therefore, ready-made the conditions which their predecessors had to evolve, and they will start therefrom upon their own evolution. Each one, being equipped with a shell of the matter of that plane, will, from this basis, proceed to gather about it a shell of the matter of the next plane. For remember that although in the cosmos the planes are extended in space, being based upon movement, in a universe the atoms of the planes are not extended in space, being the products of an image held in consciousness, but are differentiated in type. It will thus be seen that divine sparks do not have to change their place in space in order to gather atoms of another type about them, because atoms of all types are everywhere. But they merely have to change their mode of motion in order to produce a type of movement in which the atoms of another plane can take part. Whenever the coordination of movement takes place, which changes a static unit into a spinning ring of cyclic rhythm, such a change takes place, and a cyclic rhythm always gathers about it atoms of the plane below its own, because its movement approximates to theirs. For instance, as soon as a prime atom moves along a tangential path, it becomes a tangential atom. But supposing an organization of prime atoms moved along a tangential path, they would form a tangential molecule, and being larger than tangential atoms, would form a center of attraction for these atoms, and would collect a shell of attracted atoms about them. And that is how all shells are built. To return, however, to the evolution of a planetary being, it will possess, to begin with, merely an organized system of the atoms on the plane on which it originated. And when the new evolutionary swarm of divine sparks reaches it, they would find themselves with seventh-plane bodies on the seventh-plane planet. But in the course of their evolution, in that planet they will build themselves sixth-plane shells, and they will coordinate their consciousness on these shells into a group consciousness, and when they depart on their evolutionary journey, they will leave this group consciousness as an archetypal form in the consciousness of the planetary being. And this archetypal form will gather sixth-plane atoms along its lines of stress, forming a second body for the planetary being. This process is repeated with each fresh phase of evolution, until each planetary being has achieved its full complement of bodies, and is therefore able to take a swarm through the full circuit of evolution. But as each planetary being is profoundly imbued with the type of activity which the swarm was engaged upon when its form was rebuilding, each planetary being represents a different phase in evolution. They are therefore all different in character, and the evolutions conducted exclusively upon them have each a corresponding dominant note. For instance, on a seventh-plane planet, the characteristics of the seventh plane will dominate all forms developed thereon. The prime rhythm of that plane will be the keynote, and all subsequent rhythms will be multiples of it. In a planet upon the first plane, the prime rhythm will be, likewise, the rhythm of that plane. But that rhythm, being a maximum rhythm, all subsequent vibrations will be fractions of it, and on the intervening planes the prime rhythm will be as decimals. You will note that a swarm in evolution on a planet starts with the same number of bodies as that planet has, and builds an additional one in the course of its evolution, thereby endowing that planet with another body until the maximum of 7 is reached. And then devolution sets in, wherein planets and sparks divest themselves of bodies. That subject will be dealt with later. You will also perceive the order of evolution in a universe is the opposite of the order of evolution in the cosmos, because a universe is reflected from the mere consciousness of a great entity. Abstract movement gives rise to forms in the cosmos. forms give rise to abstract movements in a universe, and thereby link themselves on to the cosmos, of which more later. It is therefore essential in a universe to have a form in order to evolve to cosmic level. The aim of a universe is to raise every atom to cosmic level, thereby enabling them to link themselves on to the cosmic atoms that gave rise to them, thereby making these cosmic atoms into great entities. Thus do the atomic planes of the cosmos evolve. This is the secret of the divinity of man. He is related primarily not to the God of his universe, which is his conditioner, but to his creator, which is a corresponding atom in the cosmos, which creates but has no power to condition, because it itself conditioned by the great entity of which it forms a part. But when the reflected atom of a universe develops a corresponding aspect to the nature of its creator, and can thereby unite with it, that cosmic atom receives into itself all the conditions of the universe which was projected by the great entity of whose body it forms a part. And as that universe is conditioned by the great entity, the cosmic atom thus becomes a replica of the great entity, and being thus completely conditioned by it, it no longer being conditioned, but has been conditioned, and therefore its conditioning is of the past, and therefore in the present it is unconditioned by the great entity, because it has achieved a state in which it conditions itself, and so is independent. It is made free of the cosmic planes. It is no longer held in bondage to the service of a great entity, but by means of this attachment of an evolved atom of a projected universe, it is raised above the status of the atoms of its plane, and becomes in its turn a traveling atom. And together with its attached divine spark of the reflected universe, it makes the round of the rays of the cosmos, and thus, in its turn, becomes a great entity and develops a universe. This is the goal of the evolution of every reflected atom in a universe, to develop a divine spark, to complete the evolution from the human to the divine in a reflected universe, and to unite with its cosmic creator, thus enabling the cosmic atom to evolve through the phase of a traveling atom into a great entity. It is this scheme of evolution which we are now considering. These last details have never been revealed before. Human thought has never before passed beyond the conditioning logos. But it is now revealed that, though the logos is the creator of a universe, each atom in that universe is separately created by a separate cosmic atom, which aspires, by means of that reflected life, to achieve a state whereby it can continue its own evolution. Therefore it can be said of men that, by eating of the tree of knowledge, they should be as gods. This knowledge has been withheld on the outgoing path of evolution, lest souls should be tempted to turn back and forestall their goal. But to those who have passed the nadir, it can now lie revealed. Chapter 15. Evolution of the Lords of Flame, Form and Mind. We are now in a position to reconsider in greater detail the evolution of a divine spark. Let it be noted to begin with that the first swarm of divine sparks differ from its successors in many respects. To begin with, the first swarm is composed of the traveling atoms of the universe. Secondly, these divine sparks are subjected to no other influence than those of the Logos itself, because, satellites not having been developed, they are not exposed to the influence of the planetary beings. Therefore, the sparks of the first swarm have the divine image impressed on them in all its purity, unblurred by other influence. There is an absence of cross-currents in the influences which play upon the first swarm, which causes them to attain to the divine ideal, with much less stress and effort than their successors. In their composition, the influences of the cosmos predominate, Each subsequent swarm, however, performs its evolution in a more highly evolved universe, and therefore the influence of the cosmos find a potent rival in the influences of the universe. Another point in which the evolution of the first swarm differs from the evolution of any subsequent swarm is this. The first swarm gathers the material out of which their bodies are made, from the undifferentiated atoms of the plane on which they evolve. They thus carry on these atoms with them to the next globe of their evolution, and so throughout the planes, so that upon each globe upon which they evolve, the potentialities of reaction corresponding to all the planes above it in the universe are established by the methods previously explained. These divine sparks, thus passing down the planes, leave behind them a series of archetypes, and when they pass back up the planes, by a method to be described hereafter, they become the power and potencies which conduct the evolution of their successors. These are the lords, the principalities, and the regents of whom you have heard. The method of evolution of the subsequent swarm differs from that of the archetypal sparks, the lords having received from the archetypal sparks the concept of their evolutionary achievement, impacts this on the divine sparks of the second swarm by the method of vibration previously described, so that they start out on their evolution with the innate capacities for reaction laboriously built up by their predecessors, and they find themselves under the influence of a sphere of forces which the activities of the atomic portion of their predecessors formed into a sphere of a satellite. They, in their turn, collect shells of the matter of the plane about their vortices in the course of their evolution. But there is this point of difference. They have not got to build a group mind out of their consciousness. They have merely got to attune themselves to one who already exists. They have got to become at one with their sphere, which includes the influence of the previous swarm, as well as their own swarm, and not merely at one with themselves. When this oneness is achieved, and the Logos has contemplated the results, and turned inward to its subjective meditation, these sparks do not continue in the sphere of the satellites, as did their predecessors of the first swarm. But, the logoidal attraction being withdrawn, the mass of the globe upon the next plane attracts them, and they are disengaged from the centripetal forces of the globe on which they are, and pass onward. Upon the next globe they take up the next phase of their evolution in precisely the same way as their predecessors, and again recapitulate their predecessors' behavior up to the point of departure to the fifth plane globe. Here a change occurs. The second swarm, having arrived at the second globe of their evolution, do not pass on to the third immediately, but are now exposed, the Logos being again withdrawn into a subjective state, to two sets of planetary influences, those of the first and third globes, the first swarm always keeping a globe ahead of them. They are therefore pulled two ways, and this conflicting influence is sufficient to overcome the attraction of the individual atoms for their atomic shells. The atomic shells then fall to pieces and return to their original condition as atoms of the plane to which they belong. But though they are freed from the influence of the divine sparks, they are immediately caught up by the influence of the forces of the sphere in which that evolution has taken place, and are retained therein. Thus, upon the sixth plane, a planetary being will have not only the sixth plane atoms held along its line of forces, but also the seventh plane atoms shed by the divine sparks. A planetary being, being it noted, is really the conditioning influence of the life that evolves in its sphere. The divine sparks that are thus deprived of their atoms are reduced to their original state of a seventh plane atom attached to a divine spark, and in this state consequently re-enter the sphere of the manifesting of the unmanifest, which in the universe corresponds to the central stillness of the cosmos. And therein they receive anew the impress of the logoidal image, plus the fruits of the evolutionary achievements of the archetypal sparks, the archetypal sparks being always a plane ahead of their evolution. The second swarm sparks always start out on their new round with potentialities of reaction of an additional plane. As they pass out through the planes, they are therefore gathered about them the matter of each plane they pass through, forming it into concentric shells, as has been previously described, until they arrive at the fifth plane. There they build up a shell of fifth plane matter with the influence of the fifth plane planet, and repeat the process of assimilation to the group mind in shedding of the shells and the return to the center. It will now be perceived that there is a fundamental difference between each swarm. The first swarm is engaged solely with magnetic action and reactions and vibrations, and they are called, in the technical terms of occultism, the Lords of Flame. The second swarm is concerned with the building of matter into form of the planetary beings, and they are called the Lords of Form. We will now deal with the third swarm. They issue forth as before seventh plane atoms, stamped with the logoidal image, but of a more evolved type than either of their predecessors, because the Logos has evolved by means of the evolution of their predecessors. They proceed to the planetary sphere of the seventh plane, and herein the difference of their evolution from that of their predecessors becomes apparent, for they do not collect the matter of the sphere to form a body, but use only the matter which is under the influence of the planetary being, in whose sphere they are evolving. And as this matter is accustomed to react to an ensouling divine spark, it is much easier to manipulate than the matter of space. Therefore this evolution is more rapid. But as these divine sparks cannot advance to the globe beyond that upon which they are evolving, until the preceding swarm has moved on, they are compelled to remain upon the globe of their evolution after they have exhausted possibilities of reaction, and the superabundant energies, to which the evolving channel is closed, make play among themselves. This is the first instance of free will within the cosmos, and it is resultant activities, building individualized reactions into the atoms, is called epigenesis. This is the first occasion on which the atoms are differentiated one from another, and this leads to the applying to this swarm of the name Lords of Mind, because individualized experience is the basis of personality. It will here be seen that a new evolving principle is introduced, that the checking of progress in one direction enables a force to elaborate upon the original type, and lifts or sublimates it to a new aspect. If, however, the checking be too long continued, it would cause it to revert to a more primitive type. This, however, cannot occur at the present phase, because the synthesis of forces upon these planes is perfect, but is merely referred to in order that the correspondence may be seen. The process of evolving a new aspect of a checked force is called sublimation. The process of returning to a simpler type of evolution is called degradation, and it is always harmful because the capacities of reaction acquired at a more advanced level cannot be controlled or checked by the governing forces of a more primitive state. They would develop an extreme individualism, thus breaking up the synthesis of force on the plane on which they find themselves. You will, of course, perceive that it is the same type of process which sets free a traveling atom for its evolution to a higher state of existence. But a traveling atom has completed the circuit before it undergoes this experience, and may be termed the child of the cosmos, or of the universe, as the case may be, born at full term. And the regressive or degraded atom is one born out of due time, an abortion. If it lives at all, it lives as a monster, This is the origin of certain types of devils. Fortunately, the balance at the phase of evolution we are discussing are perfectly adjusted, because the influence of the Logos is the only influence in the universe. Therefore, no such retrogression can take place among the primal swarms. It is up to epigenesis, in the transition state, that we owe the origin of evil in the universe. Thus the swarms pass on, the lords of flame leaving behind them galvanic stresses of all types, the lords of form leaving behind them a sediment of atoms, which are built into great spherical shells by the galvanic stresses, so that each plane is dominated by a set of galvanic stresses which develop into a planetary being, and a set of the shells of the matter of other planes held into a form or body by that planetary being, which develops into a planet as known to astrology. But be it noted that each planet, although it ultimately possesses matter of all 7 planets, has a planetary being formed of the stresses of the plane on which it is. Thus, the planetary being of the 5th plane would be an abstract mind, and the planetary being of the earth is an etheric double. We have now traced the 3 primary swarms of the outgoing arc, and you will see how each carries a new factor from plane to plane. The first swarm, the Lords of Flame, do not return to the central point of manifestation until they have completed the round, and have been down the planes and back up the planes, and have thus completed their evolution. The second swarm, the Lords of Form, return to the central point of manifestation only after they have recapitulated their evolution and mastered an additional plane. That is to say, in their first outgoing, they progress through 2 globes and return. In their second outgoing, through 3 globes and return, and so on, always following in the wake of the first swarm, with whose evolution they synchronize, because as soon as the first swarm has achieved a new factor, the Logos assimilates it and enters a subjective phase to do so. During that phase, as previously said, the universe is left to its own devices. The first swarm, upon its globe, settles down to stereotype its reactions, and it is the influence of that organized globe in otherwise unorganized universe which breaks up the shells of the second swarm in the preceding globe, and so sends them back to the central point of manifestation. Likewise, the progress of the third swarm is synchronized, because they have to wait for the second swarm to withdraw from a planet before they can advance to it. The evolution of the first swarm is slowest because it is all original work for them. The second swarm occupy much time in their evolution because they are constantly recapitulating and gathering up and breaking in new matter of the different planes, and therefore synchronize well enough with the progress of the first swarm. But the third swarm has much of its evolutionary work already done for it, and therefore has to wait beyond the time needed for recapitulation. Hence, it elaborates itself. Elaboration means differentiation, and differentiation means personality. Chapter 16. The influences of the Lords of Flame, Form and Mind. Having traced the evolution of the Lords of Flame as far as the 7th globe, which they form upon the first plane, we will now trace the course of their return to the center. It will be perceived that, by their nature, they have built those systems of magnetic stresses which constitute the framework of the globes, and are afterwards elaborated into planetary beings. On their return journey, they progress back along the line of globes by which they came out. There is this difference, however. Instead of building themselves a form in the matter of a plane, they find the form already built, but they also find it inhabited by the succeeding swarm of divine sparks, who are undergoing evolution thereon. So that, on the 6th globe, 2 sets of lives are being lived, the second swarm on the outward arc, and the first swarm on the arc of returning. The first swarm, entering into the already prepared group mind, have objective consciousness. The second swarm, engaged in building a group mind, have subjective consciousness only. Therefore, the sparks are not aware of their companions of the first swarm, who also inhabit this globe, though they live in their influence, which has the effect of imparting to the shells of the matter of that plane, which have formed about the divine sparks, the same type of vibration as to that which the seed atoms of the first swarm are themselves vibrating. This is the familiar phenomena of the impactation of a cyclic rhythm inducing a vibration. When this condition has been reached, the second swarm, being able to vibrate to the same rhythm as the first, becomes aware of the members of the first, not by direct perception, but by perception of the changes of the outermost shell induced by the presence of the first. This, however, does not occur until the end of the period of evolution, whereupon both swarms quit the planet, the second to advance to the seventh globe, and the first to return to the fifth. In addition to the influence they exert upon their fellow sojourners in a globe, the first swarm have certain evolution to undergo on their own account. On their outward journey they have collected to themselves shells of each plane, which they have not shed but have carried out with them. And on the return journey each shell forms a means of reaction to the matter of each plane on which they find themselves. Being capable of both action and reaction, these form vehicles of manifestation and means of perception. Thus the indwelling spark is able to act on and react to the matter of each plane on which it finds itself. And though it carries out its evolution in the sphere of attraction of the globe on that plane, it can yet extend its activities a certain way beyond the sphere of the influence of that globe. This is a point whose significance will be seen later. Upon each globe on the return journey, the sparks of the first swarm exercise their influence upon the shells that are being gathered about the sparks of whatever swarm they encounter there. Upon the sixth globe they meet the second swarm. When they themselves depart to the fifth globe, the third swarm advances to the sixth globe, and so on. This causes the first and the third swarms just to miss each other. Therefore the third swarm is distinguished by this peculiarity. It never meets the lords of flame. It never encounters an evolution higher than its own, and therefore its predominating influence is that of the logoidal image, and of the production of its own epigenesis. That is why mind has so much freedom as compared with form or force. It will be seen that as each swarm except the third meets the lords of flame on a different planet, it is a different shell that is influenced by those lords. This accounts for the differences in the organization of the vehicles upon the different life waves. It is a point closely connected with practical magic, because whatever body has received the impress of the Lords of Flame, that body will be used in working upon nature forces. The Lords of Form, likewise, when developing upon a globe, exert a similar influence upon their fellow sojourners there. But being peculiarly and intimately related to the matter of that globe, their interreaction with the shells of the sparks of the junior swarm is peculiarly intimate. When, however, the lords of mind have passed the nadir and begin to return up the globes, conditions of evolution are much complicated. Because the freedom of individual action of their divine sparks has been enormously developed by successive periods of epigenesis, and in their diversity of reactions, they produce the diversity of development in the swarms that they contact. We have traced the progress of the first three life swarms as far as the first plane. We will now trace the mode of their return up the planes. It will be recalled that the Lord of Flame complete the full cycle before returning to the sphere of divine influence wherefrom they issued. The Lords of Form evolved by means of a gradually lengthening series of journeys. In the first journey they progressed as far as the sixth plane, and returned again to the sphere of divine influence. In the second journey, they progressed through 2 globes to the 5th plane, and so on down the planes until on the 6th journey they reached the 1st plane. It will thus be perceived that upon the final journey of their outgoing, they have already within themselves the capacities of reaction of all the planes, and have nothing further to acquire in that respect. They have, however, to learn the lessons of the return journey, which will be dealt with in their place. The evolution of the Lords of Mind resembles that of the Lords of Flame, in that it is a continuous journey. But at each pause, while they wait their return for progress, they make original additions to the sum of factors of their reactionary complex. It will have been noted that, from the time the first swarm sets out upon its homeward journey, 2 types of evolution will always be progressing in a globe at the same time, and the senior evolution profoundly influences that aspect of the junior evolution which correspond to its own nature. This is the prototype of the process known as initiation. These matters cannot be dealt with in detail until other aspects of the subject have been considered. They will then be reverted to. It will be remembered that upon each plane the divine sparks acquired a fresh mode of reaction. They learnt of a plane, but were limited by the conditions of that plane. Upon the return arc, they are not seeking to penetrate into and master the conditions of a fresh plane as a means of evolution, but to withdraw from a plane and thus to free themselves from its limitation, while at the same time retaining the capacities for reaction they learned thereon. This freedom can be obtained only after the complete synthesis of reactions of that plane has been achieved by the group spirit of the swarm. The synthesis is so complete that the reactions, being mutually compensating, become automatic and demand no individual compensating. Habitude renders them subconscious, and the consciousness of the sparks being directed to the reactions of a higher plane, they function according to the type of that plane, and the reactions are such that the atoms of the lower plane can no longer accommodate themselves thereto, and therefore are dispersed. In this way, the Lords of Flame withdraw up the planes. The Lords of Form progress by a different type of evolution. For each lesson they learn, they teach the Logoidal consciousness before progressing further, and they await the impact of the Logoidal image, which is the evolutionary impulse which sends them forth on their next journey. When they have been out to the uttermost plane, and returned for the 6th time, they have given their final message to the Logoidal consciousness, and the 7th journey, which, as far as they are concerned, is a repetition, can add nothing new to the Logoidal consciousness. It is their function, however, upon each globe, to make a contribution to the forces of formation in the manifested universe. Their essential type of reaction is the stereotyping of forms, and they influence profoundly the atoms that are built into the body of the planetary being of each globe. The Lords of Flame influence the evolving life sparks of each globe that they are on. The Lords of Form leave them untouched, but influence the globe itself. Were it not so, this stereotyping of form would prevent evolution in the divine sparks. As it is, the stereotyping of form in the vehicles of the planetary beings has determined in them the most primitive type of vehicle of manifestation, the sphere, an inorganic secretion of matter around a nucleus of attraction. It is the Lords of Mind who exert the predominating influence on the swarms they contact on each plane, because owing to the fact that they have achieved individualization, they are able to act upon individual sparks, and are not merely obliged to influence a group mind through a general atmosphere.